Hello everyone and welcome to my YouTube channel. My name's Rudkin and I'll be talking to you about GoPro settings. Now you may be wondering, GoPro settings. There are plenty of videos on YouTube about GoPro settings. Yes there is, and I think some of them are particularly good. But I do think they are missing one vital component. Easily stuffable. The same mount you get in the box. The video editing software. It's a vital component. In this video I want to show you the GoPro settings that I use, why I use them, and how they complement my video editing software so I can get the best high quality cinematic look that we all want from our videos. So hopefully at the end of this video you will go away with some good knowledge on how to set up your camera for your particular conditions to make your videos. Now if you're new to this channel, just to say, my primary camera is a GoPro camera and I have 4 of them, and I may use most of them all the time, and the settings that I'm about to show you will be used across all 4 cameras, and while they're out in the field with those settings they all come back with slightly different results. And this is where your video editing software can play an important part in making sure that you bring together all that raw footage to look like it came from one camera. In that post-edit creation stage, the settings complement the Final Cut Pro software that I use to produce one unified quality result. Now if you've seen my series of videos on how I made Doug's Trail, the film, I go from where I take the cameras all out into the field, how I set them up, why I set them up the way I do, bring back that footage, how I take it from raw footage to semi-raw footage, show you an efficient work process to produce high quality films in the least amount of time and the least amount of frustration. Highly urge you to go and have a look at those videos. Now the basis behind my GoPro settings is that I want the best out of my GoPros like anybody else, but importantly for me, I want the minimum amount of time in setting those cameras up. I do not want to faff around with settings out in the field, and I expect many of you are already aware trying to change those GoPro settings on such a small screen can be a really tedious affair. I do not want to use my iPhone to connect to my cameras. That wastes battery and more faff time. So all I want is a setting that works for most scenes. Put it down on the ground, push that record button, go off on my bike, ride past, pick it up and move on down the trail. So my settings aren't necessarily perfect, but I have used them for a very long time and I have found they work most of the time. That coupled with the Final Cut Pro software that I use on my Mac, I can get together some pretty good footage. So let's go through those GoPro settings I use. For POV shots, I use the following. Most of the time I use a 16:9 aspect ratio, 2.7K resolution, and at 60 frames per second set on a wide capture. Now on occasion I may switch to 4:3 to get that extra depth. But because most of my videos are shot at 16:9, changing it mid-film I think breaks the immersion for the viewer. Though there is a technique I use, like this, where I take the video footage 4:3 and expand it up and blur it. It works, but I don't think it works as well as just using 16:9 aspect ratio. So I think it's better to keep the viewer immersed in what he's trying to see instead of distracted by seeing something slightly different. Now for third person shots, I use a similar sort of setup, 16:9, 2.7K resolution, 60 frames per second, but using a linear capture window. I choose linear over wide because I want straight edges, all those vertical edges, and I think it makes it more immersive for the viewer. To me, when I look at something that's on wide or super wide, I think the viewer would get distracted by seeing rounded trees or bent trees and thinking, well, wait a minute, why are those trees bent? And so losing that immersive feeling that I'm trying to get for the video. Now the common settings for all of these setups, I have image stabilization on. I keep that on even if I'm using a tripod. I have this across all my cameras except one. That is because I have found you use stabilization and you pan left to right. The image stabilization tries to kick in and jerks the pan. And this is very difficult to fix in post-edit. I have GoPro's Pro Tune turned on, and with that I have the shutter speed set to auto and the white balance set to auto. Now white balance at auto isn't perfect, but it does mean I have one less thing to set up, And if I do have any problems, I can probably fix them in post-edit, tweaking a few exposure settings and stuff like that. If I was to change it to a manual setting, I'll probably go for 5K 5 or 6K, but I tend to stay away from that because I might forget and then ruin the rest of any subsequent footage fine when I get home, which is rather quite annoying. For ISO settings, I have a range of minimum of 100 to 400. The reason I don't go any higher than 400 is because I want to keep the noise in the image as low as possible, especially in the case where there's overcast days or I'm in the woods. I keep the sharpness to a low setting, and I might tweak that in Final Cut Pro using sharpness effect. For EV setting, I keep that generally at 0. Again, I rarely change this, but if I do change it, it will be to -0.5, and that would be on occasions where I'm finding if I go through from light, dark, down a trail where the sun's coming through, I don't want to get the scene blown out, I will change it to -0.5. Now my most important setting is color, and I set this to flat. This gives me the most dynamic range. The GoPro camera hasn't done any changes itself, so I've got the most raw footage I can get out of the camera, less the white balance alterations. The 2.7K resolution, why do I use that? Well, most of my footage goes out in HD format. I don't normally film in 4K, but I use 2.7K to give me room to do digital pans. And this you may have seen in my videos where you create that extra movement on otherwise stationary shots. Creates direction and flow in the video. So I use that to good effect. Now, one of the new things I started to use on the GoPro 8 camera is the ability to have presets. This has allowed me to experiment with other settings without risking the settings I am used to using. I can quickly change them out on the trails. So I will be using that more and more, but otherwise what you've seen here is the settings is the same for all GoPro cameras. Once I've taken all that raw footage using these GoPro settings, I bring that home and import that into the computer. So now I'm going to go through quickly what I use to supplement those settings in Final Cut Pro to produce the high quality output that we want. Okay, so now we're going to look at the timeline of a project, one of my previous projects, the local trails. And I've brought together some clips from that and switched off all the color adjustments. And so what we're going to do is go through some of these clips individually and see how I've changed them from their raw settings as from the GoPro camera, and how I've tweaked them for the final output. So we have some clips here in the order of the film, and I don't know if you notice here, they look a bit washed out, a bit flat, a bit overexposed. And these are all from the GoPro camera. The exception to this one is from the 360-degree camera, but you can see the same thing applies. This one's a little bit different. We'll talk about that one in a moment. So if we start from the beginning, we've got one here where I'm pointing the camera at the sunset, trying to get myself riding over the top of a hill very briefly. And what we'll do is we'll bring up the graphs for the color, and there we can see straight away overexposed at the top here, and you can see right in the middle of the sunset here. And we're okay at the bottom here. I have found if you move along the image, it might move a little bit, it might vary. So don't just go to the beginning of the clip, do move through the clip and see where the peaks are. In this particular case, it's pretty uniform. So what we do is we go over to the color board, and this is my primary color board. A lot of people use the color wheels and stuff like this. For me, this works for me quite well. And first of all, I go to the exposure. This is the first thing I touch. And you can see here, I would have tweaked the exposure, the mid-tones, and I've kind of left the shadows alone. That is because the shadows are almost touching the bottom of the 0%. So if I just switch that on, you can see how when this color setting is applied, it adjusts the picture and bringing everything within the 99 and 0%. Anything outside of this and we lose detail. So if we go on to the next clip, this is a good example of looking even more washed out. Obviously, we want to capture the color of the trees and everything else. So here we have a particular scene, as say it's pretty exposed. You want to capture the color of the trees, this bark, as well as the orange in my jumper. And if I switch back on the color, you can see how it's got a lot more depth to it. We've got the color scope is within range. Now if I move the midtones, now this is a personal choice. I do tend to like to keep the midtones sitting around 50 or just below 50. This one's a little bit more spread out. I find it gives a lot more depth to the picture, but there's a lot better than the raw original flat color profile from the GoPro camera. So what I do is I go through each clip in turn. I don't batch run them. I just methodically go through every single clip, tweak each one, and on particularly long clips, as I said, I run through them because at different places in the clip, color balances and exposure could have changed. And this is where you might have to use key points along the way. So you tweak it at one point, and just as maybe you or something moves into picture, then out of picture, you will have to keyframe the exposure settings to bring them, to keep them within the 0 to 100 range. If we go on to the next clip, this one you can definitely see is the sky's blown out here. We've got some colour in the leaves, and we lost a lot of colour in the leaves on the ground. So if we apply the colour correction here, and it's been brought in. Now it looks very dark in here, and this is something you'll have to play around with, and maybe it's a little bit too dark, but you can just bring it up and then tweak down a little bit. Now maybe you might want to go to a colour curve and go to the Luma curve, and you can alter the contrast that way. I tend to get most of my color correction, as I said, via the color board. As I say, go through each clip in turn, look at each one, see what we have. In this case, see I brought back the nice blue in the background there for the sky, more golden colors in here, which will all get washed out. And this is where it's particularly useful, if you can, is to have a reference display. Now each monitor has a different color profile. The more expensive monitors that you have will be more accurate in how they produce those colors, and so that's how you adjust in reference to those colors. Final Cut Pro supports a reference display. You will find if you think you've got the colors correct on your particular monitor, and then if you look on an iPhone or TV, the colors can look quite a bit different to what you set them to. You can spend quite a bit of time doing this. I do a little bit. I tend to find that the displays I have, my Apple LED Cinema display, works quite well in this respect, so I don't have to worry about that too much. So we move on to the next clip and see what we get. Again, another washed out, and here we can see that we've got nothing really touching down to 0. It's about sitting at 25. We're kind of okay at the top here, sitting under 99%. Go to the color board and switch on the thing. I see how I've pulled it down to bring the sort of reproduce that morning light. So if I switch it off, so this was obviously trying to capture my local trails in the morning, and here it all looks a bit washed out and a bit more to daylight. So I'm trying to adjust the colors to reflect what that light was in my eyes early in the morning. So this I bring down, make sure there's more contrast in the trees, more defined light in those trees where light's coming across the field and hitting the trees. And there I am in the dark. So in this case it works quite well because I'm meant to be slightly in the dark. Next clip. Oh, this one's a good one. You can see here that the majority of that picture is totally blown out via the sun coming through the trees at the back. Now I knew when I positioned the camera this was going to happen. So I did take a chance with this clip. You can see got hit on right on the note on the bottom of the shadows, but I'm just totally blown out here, so you can't see much detail on me. So let's see what I did for this. Well, I didn't change much, but I could bring up the midtones a little bit just to show you here. But it does kind of wash me out here. Now, because this is a very fast clip, what, about 2 seconds, and just reflecting action, I haven't gone to the trouble of masking myself out particularly and doing another color profile just on my body, on my top. The amount of work for that wouldn't have paid for itself in the time that you see the clip. We move on to the next clip. This one's a longer one. This one's 7 seconds long. So this is where the user will probably have more time to see what is going on, have a look around the picture. And we can see here with the color board switched off, my color settings switched off, there's a lot of stuff sitting around mid 50s and higher. You can see how it adjusts as we go through the clip, like there's more overspilling at this particular point because the sun's hitting the grass. There it's that's got nice contrast if I kept that all the way through. This is probably where I'm going to have to do some adjustment key points. Let's see what I did for this. No, I do not have any custom key points. Perhaps I just left it alone. But there, that's what I wanted to keep. You can see I've kept the shadows as they were, brought down the highlights, keep them below that line throughout the clip. And I've made my main adjustment again on the midtones. And looking at that, I've probably made a good choice actually. It's worked out quite nicely and I haven't had to put any key points in there for color adjustments. Go on to the next clip. Again, we've got quite a bit of sky. It's blown up above 99%. The shadows are sitting just above 0, which is where we want them. And there's a lot of range in between. Let's see what we did when I switched it on. I haven't changed much here, but I have brought back some color in the sky. Did I change any color? No. Oh, I did bring up the saturation bit. So my first plan of attack when I'm taking the GoPro clips from the raw form and dropping them in the timeline is to have a look at the exposure first. And then I look at the color. And then I look at the saturation. If I've made any adjustments to the color or the saturation, I go back to the exposure just to make sure that during the timeline, nothing overspills the 0 or the 99% lines in the exposure. So again, that looks pretty good, nice and rich, reflects sort of a sun coming through, bright spots, dark sunlight. This one again, I quite like this one. The color poured off. This is where the GoPro actually worked very well. I have to make very few adjustments here. You can see it's overflowed again, 99%, but it's hitting 0. So I may have just tweaked the bottom. Yes, just brought in a little bit at the same point, but keeping those shadows really dark to emphasize the sun coming through the trees. And again, I've brought down the highlights to keep within that 99 line. 99% barrier. Again, I've overemphasized the midtones here to again reflect that this is early morning. Now we move on to 360-degree footage, and this is one slightly different because, like the GoPro, it is raw, but this is pure raw. This is logarithmic, and this is using the Insta360 1X camera. And when you put that into logarithmic mode, it comes back very flat, as you can see here. So with that, before I touch any of the color, load in a custom LUT. And I would have chosen Insta360's specific 1X LUT and applied that first. That kind of brings it more into what I want, and then I make some final tweaks beyond that. So having set up the custom LUT, we go back to the color board, and you can see it's still pretty well washed out in this particular case. And when I apply the color board, you can see it's a lot better. Now you may have noticed throughout my GoPro clips and a lot of that I do not use a LUT. All I do is just bring those color profiles back into range suitable for output, tweak a few midtones, and I find that is sufficient to produce a nice rich high fidelity output. So that's it. Having taken those GoPro settings, I've got some consistency across the cameras and a little bit of variability. Bring them into Final Cut Pro, dropping them into the timeline. And the first thing I look at is the exposure, just to make sure it's in range. I then look at any color adjustments, then look at any saturation adjustments, but very rarely do I have to touch those, find it's all sufficient. But if I have, I go back to exposure and just make sure across the whole time in the clip that nothing's spilled out between the 99 and the 100. So that's it for this video. I hope you liked it. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. If you liked it even more and want to see more videos in this series, please hit that subscribe button. Be sure to hit the notifications too. Keep well, keep safe, and I'll catch up with you guys next time.